morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Claudia Simone Dorchain. I'm a PhD in philosophy from Germany, and I'm welcoming you back to my short series, Philosophers as Psychologists. Part 4, Arthur Schopenhauer on trauma and trauma-based stress or post-traumatic stress disorder. Arthur Schopenhauer was a philosopher who actually knew a lot about the human soul and oftenly addressed problems of human behavior. We might know that he himself was not a very polite citizen. Actually, he has been sued for several cases, once for insult and even for physical attacks on a woman. But Schopenhauer's point of view has always been a very rebellious one. He did not want to fit into a society whose core values he considered to be wrong, delusional, and empty. From his point of view, one had to train oneself in order to cope with all these problems which arise by necessity in a society which is coined by crime and whose criminals actually are sometimes the most highly decorated ones in politics and in the highest social ranks. Schopenhauer's point of view on life and human society was very pessimistic, and he is known as a very pessimistic thinker. But maybe we may add that he, as a pessimist, has actually seen something more clearer and sharper than optimistic philosophers. Maybe the proverbial saying is true that an optimist is someone who sees the bitterness of life, and a pessimist is someone who has to confirm himself that life is bitter each and every day. Optimism and pessimism are but two standpoints, two perspectives on the problem of misery, hardship, and even corruption within human society. Schopenhauer's standpoint is that corruption, hardship, insultations, and thus possible traumatizing events are unavoidable. They do happen in every person's life. Actually, Schopenhauer's view on traumatic events which happen with a certain necessity and unavoidability in everybody's life is not wrong according to our day social science and psychology. We may suppose that 1/3 up to 2/3 of the population is traumatized or meets a traumatizing event once in a lifetime, or even more than once in a lifetime. So Schopenhauer is somewhat correct with his pessimistic point of view, trauma happening to each and every individual. But what is actually his advice given on dealing with trauma? First of all, we have to know what Schopenhauer actually defines as trauma. In our newly coined psychological science, trauma therapy and trauma studies are relatively new, and they have been based firstly on the experience with wounded soldiers who came back from the Vietnam War. And when studied and discovered that trauma is not only a side effect of war, but also a deep conflict within the human soul, which may be caused by a normal surrounding and everyday problems which gain a certain weight and a certain complexity the individual may not cope with. So modern day science on trauma and trauma therapy went a long way from describing trauma as a post-traumatic effect on soldiers and thus only focusing on a relatively small amount of the population, to trauma being actually a common phenomenon which may affect everybody despite of his or her profession and age and social surrounding. Trauma is clinically described as every situation which causes existential fear or the fear of death, or is experienced as something life-threatening. Mobbing, for example, may be experienced as traumatizing, although it is not a trauma in the classical view of trauma as actually life-threatening and physical situations. So-called emotional violence and psychic violence and verbal violence may also cause traumatization. So Schopenhauer actually defined trauma. He did not use this notion, but he described a similar phenomenon. He described trauma as the consequence of isolation and insult. For Schopenhauer, trauma is merely caused by so-called emotional or verbal violence. And in fact, he did know a great deal about emotional and verbal violence. He wrote himself a book about heuristic technique of winning each argument by unfair practices. So he knew how to insult, and his proverbial saying of the art of insulting, or heuristic dialectics as the art of insulting someone, is very well known and very typical for him. Thus, we may not be astounded that Schopenhauer turns solely on insult as being the typical model of traumatization. But how should one cope with insults? Schopenhauer has got a certain coping strategy. In aphorismen, his aphoristic views, he actually addresses the problem of dealing with flashbacks, which clinical psychology describes as the recurring memory of a traumatizing event. What should the individual do when he or she is actually going through flashbacks? Schopenhauer has got an idea. Zur anempfohlenen Zügelung der Fantasie gehört auch noch, dass wir ihr nicht gestatten, ehemals erlittenes Unrecht, Schaden, Verlust, Beleidigungen, Zurücksetzungen, Kränkungen und dergleichen uns wieder zu vergegenwärtigen und auszumalen. This is but one sentence of a longer treatise. It says in English that a person who is traumatized or re-traumatizes and goes through flashbacks should not allow his or her imagination to recreate or reenact these situations. He or she should suppress his memories or her memories. He also alludes on the picture of the human soul being like a city. This is a very ancient picture. It has been around in antiquity and in the mystical philosophy of medieval thinkers, the human soul as a so-called Burg, as a city, as a town. And Schopenhauer makes allusion on the human soul as a town with certain hierarchical structures of citizens. There are some citizens who would like to create a riot and to make a revolution. And he compares rioting citizens within a city or a town with those recurring memories of traumatizing events. Yeah? He basically says that our flashbacks are just like rebellious citizens. A good ruler should suppress these riots in order to restore public peace. For him, the good ruler is the intellect. He actually advises traumatized people to use their intellect in order to suppress those rebellious remembrances of former insults and hurting events. From the standpoint of modern-day psychology, Schopenhauer's idea on how to cope with trauma cannot work out. We know that we cannot deal with traumatizing memories and flashbacks by suppressing them. They become even worse. The only way to cope with traumatizing memories is, according to our today's state of research, not to suppress them, as Schopenhauer advises, but to go through them, to be aware of them, to have a close look at them in order to heal them. Not by suppression, but by acceptance, understanding and integration. Traumatic memories can actually be healed.